Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our panel today and for being with One Country All Day. I am North Carolina Representative and One Country Project Board Member Ashton Clements. And I serve the House District 57 in North Carolina, which is in Guilford County. There's currently only about 15% of the workforce has access to family leave programs, and many of them are unpaid leave programs. Family medical leave situations are a significant driver of turnover in the workforce, drive gender disparity in the workplace, and cause undue stress for families with younger children of aging parents. I'm currently a representative, but was an elementary school teacher and principal who has three children myself. And even as an educator who gives your life to children, we had to take unpaid leave once we had our own children, and it was only for 6 weeks that was covered. So we have a long way to go to be providing and supporting families as they bring our new Americans into our country. We have two great speakers joining us to discuss the prospects for paid family leave in the United States and to tell us more about how paid family leave would benefit every American family, rural or urban. We have Adrienne Schwer is the fellow and lead of the Paid Family Leave Task Force at the Bipartisan Policy Center. After years of service on Capitol Hill and in political campaigns, Adrienne joined U2 frontman Bono's nonprofit organization, The One Campaign, where she led partnership strategy and advocacy in support of African development, including maternal and child health. From 2014 to 2017, Adrienne served as Chief of Protocol to Defense Secretaries Chuck Hagel, Ashton Carter, and Jim Mattis in the Pentagon. During her tenure, she helped roll out a 12-week paid maternity leave policy for the military. Adrienne and her husband have 5 children, so she clearly knows the value of paid family leave. We also are joined by Corinne McSwiggan, who is an economic policy advisor at Third Way. Corinne works to develop and advance modern policy agenda for America's toughest economic problems, from supporting policy efforts to help working families, to researching how supply chain issues drive inflation, to thinking about how to make progress on paid leave. Corinne is committed to helping create an economy where everyone, everywhere can thrive. Her analysis has been featured in Bloomberg, Axios, The Hill, and Forbes. Adrienne and Corinne, welcome to the Rural Progress Summit. I love to be on this panel with 3 women. So welcome to being with us. To begin, could you each speak a little on the various types of family situations that could be covered under the paid leave program? And if I missed anything on your introduction, feel free to jump in. So Corinne, we will start with you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me. So when we're thinking kind of about paid leave programs and the types of family situations that are covered, I usually think there are kind of 3 types or reasons for leave that we're talking about. So the first is kind of parental leave, which is when a parent is welcoming kind of a new child and taking time off to care for them. The second reason is medical leave. So when someone needs to take off a longer period of time to care for their own illness, say recovering from a surgery or going through a cancer treatment. And then finally, kind of the third reason for leave is for caregiving purposes. So which is caring for a family member. And this can often mean caring for an aging parent or helping care for a sibling who is recovering from an illness or a surgery. And kind of when we're thinking about these family situations, I think it's important to point out that many people either fall into 2 of these at the same time or need to take leave for any of these 3 reasons at some point in their life. And I think you had mentioned, we are seeing more and more people kind of a part of this sandwich generation caring for both a child and an aging parent at the same time, while others may need to care for a new child and then at another point take their own medical leave. So I think that kind of highlights that there's a need for paid leave that looks different for each family, but this shared perspective that we all might need paid leave at some point, and it's kind of likely that we actually will need paid leave. 1 in 5 Americans are caregivers, and I think just the pandemic overall reminded us that it's obvious that people can get sick and need to take time off of work. And so I think that in itself really emphasized the need to take time to care for yourself or your loved one shouldn't have to mean, missing out on a paycheck or being able to pay to put food on the table.
Yes, so many of us had to all of a sudden be doing a lot of caretaking that we were not having to do and still needed to keep our jobs and keep our economy rolling. Thank you, Adrienne.
First of all, I think paid family and medical leave is deeply misunderstood. 30 years ago, a beautiful bipartisan law called the Family and Medical Leave Act was passed and codified into law and protected your job. If you needed to go out and leave your work for a long period of time, to take care of a newborn or fostered or adopted baby, to care for yourself or to care for a loved one, like Curran was saying. That law covers about 60% of the workforce and has been a tremendous protector of workers when they need to balance work and life. And so they can stay connected to the workforce if that's what they choose to do. What hasn't happened in those 30 years, there has been an increase, not as fast as I would like it, of people having paid time off. And that is so much more important today than it was 30 years ago, where most families have one or both parents in the workforce, and they're just trying to make ends meet. They're barely able to afford childcare. They're barely able to have the families they want. And most importantly, as Curran said, we are experiencing that the people who are of childbearing years and have these young children in the home are also caring for aging adults and playing a critical role in their lives. Without paid time off, they are put in an impossible position to try and balance their full-time work while doing their personal responsibilities. And Representative Clemons, I think the best illustration of this for everybody on this call to understand is that most nurses and most teachers like you don't get a single day of paid parental leave. So they have babies, many of them women, and return to work a lot faster than they should. And you don't want a nurse 3 weeks postpartum taking care of you or your loved one in the hospital. And they shouldn't have to do that. But that is what a lot of women face if they haven't accrued enough sick time to cover a couple weeks or a couple months off, or if they're not lucky enough to work for an employer that has decided to prioritize a paid leave benefit. And that's why it is so important that in this country, we really start thinking about a bold, bipartisan, comprehensive solution for these types of problems for workers.
I think when the Family Medical Leave Act was passed, we felt like it was going to be this huge momentum, and then it just really hasn't led to actual practical ways for people. It's almost, I wonder if we passed that and then we felt like we were done, and we had what would you say has been the biggest factors in us stalling on making progress to getting to the paid part of it for our families? Adrienne, and then we'll go to Curran.
I think that the FMLA law was bold, bipartisan, lasting, and has served millions and millions of people. It's amazing. It should be modified. It exempts every small business that has 50 employees or less. And maybe that threshold should be 45 or 40. I don't know. But we've done a lot of studying on it. And it's not like there's a perfect reason that 50 is the exemption. If you don't live within 75 miles of if your employer does, there's a 75-mile rule that feels so ridiculous in this new world where so many people are virtual, and that should be modified. We also have, and you must work so many hours within and work for your employer for a full year. Well, we have a pretty transitional workforce today that's different than it was in the past. So I want to see FMLA modified, because the more people who have job protection, the more likely their employers are to offer them paid leave. But really, I'm going to look on the bright side. We haven't had a bold paid leave conversation. We've had a beautiful Democratic coalition around paid leave. I mean, it has been the progressive side of the party to the moderate side of the party. When you get Heidi Heitkamp and Bernie Sanders on a bill in the Congress 3 years ago, you know you have something really good. But that bill's never been bipartisan. It's never been marked up in committee. It's never gotten a full committee vote. We have a lot of work I come from the Bipartisan Policy Center, so you know what I want. I want like smart, moderate people to be thinking about lasting policy, and I want the next version of the FMLA. I think we have that moment right now. And I think you all heard from Mr. Allred from Texas, the first man to take paternity leave in Congress. He's taken it twice now, setting the most amazing example for men across the country and men in Congress. He sits at a new working group in the House, a bipartisan working group, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, trying to forge a bipartisan compromise on paid leave. We've never seen anything like it. And that is what I'm inspired by right now, and what I think has the potential to get us to new lasting policy. And it'll take leadership like Mr. Allred to get that going.
I love that. And I've loved seeing the dads in Congress who have been part of kind of this newer generation that's coming through. My own husband owns a small construction company. And one of his key employees is a dad who asked for paternity leave, which my husband provided. It was the first time he had ever done that. And it was the first time he had been asked. So even in small ways, we see some progress with paternity leave as well.
So cool.
Yeah.
And that's hard. I'm sure that was really hard for your husband as a small business employer. It takes a lot. It's hard to backfill. It's hard to pay for those things, but pays dividends. There's a lot of data that shows that it increases, the employee retention, employee happiness, their commitment to the company. But it is a big risk and it's hard for a lot of people. I want to flip over. You talked about the dads. There is so much beautiful science. When a dad is present for the birth and first few weeks of its child's life, he physically releases a hormone called oxytocin, the love potion that makes him fall more in love with his baby and his partner. And when a dad is present in a child's life, their economic, their academic, their social and cognitive outcomes are transformed. Their chances of ending up in our criminal justice system go down exponentially. And that will only happen if men like your husband and like Mr. Allred and like Secretary Buttigieg stand up and take the leave, regardless of the arrows shot at them about not needing it, because the downstream effects are really beautiful. And that is one place where Republicans and Democrats surprisingly agree, is on gender parity and paid parental leave and paid family leave.
Yes. I was proud of my husband because I think the request took him a little off guard. But just as you said, for a very valued employee, that's a small investment in their long-term well-being as an employee and moving forward. So Curran, what would you add to kind of what we've seen as barriers? And, we kind of moved into some things that are making us feel a little optimistic. So what would you add there?
Yeah, I think, going back to FMLA, I think the 30 years ago, thinking about how that law got passed, and as Adrienne said, that big bipartisan, bold law, it took 10 years of, advocates working and just kind of this long fight to get that passed. And there are still a lot of flaws, as Adrienne mentioned, kind of there are room for improvement to ensure that the unpaid job protected leave can even capture more workers. But I think it shows us that fight for FMLA gives us hope for what can we do now. This is not, as we continue to fight for paid leave, it doesn't have to be kind of like we passed one thing and that's it. That continued progress is possible. And I think if you look at the states and local level as well, we're seeing, when FMLA was passed, there was no kind of comprehensive paid leave program at the state level. And now you have more states every year passing paid leave programs. So I think it kind of shows you that there is that momentum. And I think, as Adrienne mentioned, the bipartisan paid family leave working group in the House is just a great example of that momentum and that willingness to, say, this is the moment, let's drive forward this progress. And, we're, very much supportive of a really big Democratic legislation like the Family Act. But if that's not what we can get done this Congress, like what are the steps that we can take to kind of pave our way there? How do we kind of see the little wins today as the way to kind of get to that comprehensive and robust legislation that we know that we need to get paid leave to more workers and support working families?
Yes, I think all of us who are in legislative sausage making or as a legislator or as analysts or people that are working on it know that there's certainly the ideal that we get to, but that a lot of times we need to be able to take small steps forward to get there. So Curran, what would you say is the ideal paid family leave policy, and what do you see as progress along the way? And then we'll get the same answer from Adrienne.
Yeah, so I mentioned the Family Act, which is legislation that's recently been reintroduced actually by Representative DeLauro and Senator Gillibrand, and that builds a really big, comprehensive paid family and medical leave program. And I think what's important, it provides a benefit that replaces a significant portion of workers' wages with a real focus on helping the lowest wage workers in our economy, which is super significant, I think, for any program that we're thinking about. It's ensuring that part-time workers, which women are more likely to be part-time than men, or self-employed workers, gig workers, those types of people are being captured in the program. And I think it's, really comprehensive piece of legislation that is the ideal, but kind of, as we mentioned, given the current political situation, it does feel unlikely. So what are kind of steps that we can take? And I think Adrienne pointed out a great one in modifying FMLA. How can we get more workers access to unpaid job protected leave, especially thinking about the populations that aren't getting access. Women, between younger women who are working, a third of them haven't been at their jobs for at least a year. And to get FMLA, you have to have been at your place of employment for a year. So these kind of tweaks that can be made to FMLA can have a significant impact. And I know that the Bipartisan Policy Center has done some really great work on kind of on that. And I also think just passing paid sick leave is something that we've seen some bipartisan support for, and that could be kind of leading to a path to more medical leave down the line. So I think when we're talking about what do we see as the ideal paid leave program, it's great to have that and be thinking about that. And then also thinking about what are the little steps that we can be taking to get there, reforming FMLA, paid sick leave, or thinking about caregiving. I know a tax credit for caregiving costs has been a big part of that conversation on a bipartisan level as well. So just kind of those little things that what can we do now to make that progress?
I'll add on and just say, she was talking about the Family Act from Rosa DeLauro and Kirsten Gillibrand. Senator Gillibrand will forever be a champion of big, bold paid leave policy. But she has publicly said that she wants to start working with Republicans on things that can help working families balance their caregiving responsibilities in life. And that might not be perfect policy. And that, to me, is the moment we're in and what makes this world so exciting. I feel confident that we could have passed almost 10 years ago now a very meaningful paid parental leave program in a bipartisan way, and it could have been lasting, and BBB could have built upon it. And it wouldn't have been perfect, but it would have been a whole lot better than what we have today. And I'd like to see some wind in the sails of, baby steps on policy, national programs, national conversations, national changes to labor law that really protect workers. That's what I think we're going to get in today's political environment. I'll tell you a story about something that happened last year that I'm really excited about. We finally passed a law called the Pregnant Worker Fairness Act. For the first time, there's a law, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, that was signed into law a very long time ago that makes sure that pregnant women aren't discriminated against during the hiring. But you can discriminate against them once they're in your company. All you want. There was no real legal protections against that type of discrimination. And there was no requirement of accommodation. So you had pregnant workers, pregnant people that were being forced to do hard manual labor, really putting their pregnancies and their personal health at risk. And there were no laws protecting them. And we now had a bipartisan law passed by Senator Casey of Pennsylvania. If you haven't followed him and you don't know all the amazing things he does, he took 10 years to pass this law. He rolled up his sleeves, worked hard with multiple Republicans, and passed it in the winter of last year. And now almost all pregnant Americans that work for a company of, a much smaller than 50 employees, I think it's 25 employees or more company, have full protections and are required to be accommodated if they are pregnant at work. Huge, monumental change. And we can do more than that. We can do a lot more than that to help workers balance these really, really wonderful and scary times in their lives. So I am interested to see hard work being done to increase paid leave of any kind, more medical leave, more parental leave, more family caregiving leave, even if it isn't perfect policy, because I know we can build on it.
Yes, it's awesome to hear stories of success that are making progress for sure. One of the state policies that we worked on in North Carolina, and I filed it in a bipartisan way, we haven't gotten it through yet, but is a kin care provision, which would allow expand sick leave usage to be for either your aging parents or dependent children, and that would have to be used. So there are small steps we can take along the way as we're trying to make progress. And
I love that. I can't wait to see you sign that into law. I know you will. Congrats.
Me too. We're going to keep trying for sure. And, I think we think a lot about paid family leave from bringing a baby or a new child into a family, but I think there's more and more advocacy, at least in North Carolina and probably across the country, for needing to be able to take care of aging parents, having AARP involved in that discussion. Is there anything you want to add about how this impacts, expand our view a little bit of what paid family leave it is about moms and dads who are just having new babies, but it's much beyond that. Curran, we'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the caregiving aspect of paid leave is such a significant part of this because it is something that's affecting so many Americans, being 1 in 5 being a caregiver right now for a family member in some form. And I think too, when you're thinking about kind of you could be caring for a dependent child, for a sibling, for a parent, or especially as we kind of see different family kind of environments, you might be caring for a grandparent as well. So I think ensuring that paid leave programs or unpaid leave protections also allow for these kind of different definitions of family is super important. And I know also this conversation is kind of is in the context of rural America. And, we're kind of seeing rural America over 20% now. I think we're at the threshold is over the age of 65. So we're going to see more rural workers kind of either they're currently caring for, aging parents or family members, or they will be. And so I think that's important too. When we're talking about how do we support rural workers and working families, that a part of that is caregiving leave, because as you said, it's not just, parental leave, and that's an important part of it, but it's also ensuring that, if I have to take my, mother to a doctor's appointment, that I'm able to do that in a way that doesn't mean that I have to give up a day of work. And I think thinking about that from that perspective as well is super important.
I think here there are just less and less options for other, particularly in rural North Carolina and America, for childcare, but also for adult, elderly folks. There are less and less options we see. So I think it is increasing the challenges day by day.
I was going to add to the other side. So, 3 types of leave: parental leave, family caregiving leave, and then medical leave. In the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, medical leave was getting hit by a car, or, getting cancer, or having hips and knee surgery. In today's world, that is a lot of mental and behavioral health services. So a lot of people are needing significant time off of work to go to treatment for addiction. They need significant time off of work to suffer through and get treated for PTSD, from gun violence, from sexual assault, from the realities of our world today. Medical leave is a different thing than it was before. And it is super important to workforce participation. So anybody on this call who's dealing with, a tight labor market, your constituents and your friends are really struggling with getting people back to work, a huge cohort of those people that are unable to work right now are suffering from mental and behavioral health, and they need things like paid leave to get to work, get the service they need, and get back to work. So I would just encourage people to always look at, this isn't a panacea solution. It's not going to solve all of the world's problems. It has a lot of nuance to it, but man, it could really, really help working families, because today's working family is struggling with a lot of very different things than their predecessors were.
Yes. I think we see that with across the board, those increased needs and needing to support people. So I love that. A different way to expand paid family leave and kind of what we're talking about here. Okay, so help us get from the abstract idea to how this may concretely work. What would it look like if it was like my husband, small business led, or business and people that are coming into and providing paid family leave, and then a different approach is that the government may be paying it. So help us get concrete on what that would look like. Curran, we'll start with you.
So I think kind of what we're seeing is that a paid leave program at the federal level, or just momentum towards kind of a federal paid leave policy, is super important. And I know we're kind of seeing a sort of a patchwork policy system right now, right? Where some people are getting paid leave from their employers and some are getting through states, but a lot of Americans are not getting paid leave or even unpaid leave. And I think that's where federal policy can really help fill in the gaps. When you're kind of relying on employers to kind of opt in to providing paid leave, the example that you gave is so great. But I think you're kind of relying on employers to do that, and many might not have done the same in the same situation. And I think when you're kind of relying on employers to kind of choose to offer this benefit, it's really leaving behind the most vulnerable and low income workers, thinking about workers who have college degrees or who are more likely to work professional kind of office jobs, that you're thinking, okay, they're more likely to get employer sponsored benefits like paid leave. And you don't want that sort of paid leave is not a benefit that should be only available to a certain group of workers. And also thinking from the employer side, I think Adrienne touched on it a little bit, but federal policy might actually be preferred in some senses. Like right now, with the patchwork of policies we have, if an employer has a location in California and in Rhode Island, they're kind of navigating the two different state kind of paid leave systems, and a federal policy might actually be preferred. And I think for small businesses as well, it can be difficult to kind of do that on their own, stand up a small, a paid leave program, be able to kind of offer that benefit or cover the cost of hiring a temporary replacement. And I think that's where a federal program or policy can really help support those medium and smaller sized businesses be able to offer workers paid leave in the way that a lot of larger, employers like Amazon already are able to. So they're kind of supporting that growth of small and medium sized businesses as well.
I know a lot of people on this call are active and influential in state and local politics. I am a little bit sad to say, one state passed paid leave in their legislature this year, the state of Minnesota, pretty bold, but we haven't seen a lot of movement outside of, blue trifecta states. So for the purple states or, those of you who operate in red states, the pathway looks very different. And the best pathway forward is a federal policy. So I really, really want to see our combined power focused on empowering this federal policymaker bipartisan set to get something done and to really change the game for a lot of families. I don't know how it happens without it. To Curran's point, there is a patchwork. There are 13 states that have passed laws. They're incredible. They really are serving families. If you go to Washington State or California or New York and see what they're doing, it's really wonderful. But there isn't a groundswell of red and purple states that are heading in that direction. And I think that should encourage us to look at the tremendous foundation that we have at the federal level to do something big and bold. It just might not be as big and bold as BBB wanted it to be. But I think it can be done at the federal level in a way that respects the nuances of small businesses and the fact that they really cannot handle a mandate or a forced policy while still ensuring that the most vulnerable workers in our country are getting access to something that could really be transformational for them.
Yeah, I think my husband's example was a good one because he has a wide range of employees and their salaries. And, he was able, when we're talking about one employee, right, he could make that decision. But for many of our particularly women and particularly women of color, we know are working disproportionately in childcare and healthcare industries. And without, those places are not going to have the same level of resources or ability to say yes for our most vulnerable workers. So, what would it look like if there were federal legislation? And we've kind of said there's the ideal, but how many weeks would we be ideally doing? What would, how much of a salary would be covered? What would be kind of those nuts and bolts? We'll start with Adrienne and then go to Curran.
So I'm going to take my perfect policy dreams and put them aside for a second and talk about what I think is in the art of the possible. I think that science has proven that men and women need 12 weeks of paid parental leave. You can plan for it. You kind of know when it's going to happen in most situations. It's truly transformational to the health and well-being of the family, the mom, the dad, the children. And I think that is a reasonable expectation. I think the amount of wage replacement, are you getting 100% of your paycheck or 25%? Depends on your income bracket. And low wage workers, we can get up to that 90%, maybe more. I think moderate and high wage workers are going to have a very little, a blip on the radar in comparison, but they are most likely to get something really meaningful from their employer. And then I think for family caregiving and medical, things are going to look a little different. So the average amount of time that people take FMLA for family caregiving is about 2 weeks. It's usually to help a loved one get through a major surgery, hospital stay, transition to elder care, or it's intermittent leave. Like they need to take off, 2 hours every week to go help their mom through these doctor's appointments. So I think you could get by with a federal family caregiving policy that's smaller than parental leave, but still tremendously impactful to families. I also think that on caregiving, The AARP has a really cool idea called the caregiving tax credit, because a lot of people doing family caregiving have major expenses, out-of-pocket expenses that they're covering for their family members. And it'd be great to be able to write off those expenses in some way. And on medical leave, I'm torn on the value of federal policy. I know how important it is, but I think on medical leave, there's more than income replacement. I think right now, about 50% of workers have something called short-term disability. It's a private insurance product. Many of you who work in white-collar jobs might have access to it. What's different about it, it gives you income replacement, right? It pays you the check. It's only 66% of your wages or something. But it also has services for the employer and employee. So it helps the employee get access to their health, their mental health, behavioral health, physical health care benefits. Like if you have a hip surgery and you take medical leave on short-term disability, they're the ones that send you the little chair that goes on top of the toilet to make sure you don't fall a second time, right? They want you to get back to work. They want to make sure that you're healthy. And then they also work with your employer on navigating the labor laws and like making sure they're compliant, which for your husband's business, Rep. Clemens, is really important, right? He probably doesn't have an HR person who's helping make sure that he's not getting himself in trouble or that he's following the law to the code. And I think there's value in that. And I'm not sure a government policy has the perfect solution to replace all that value. But I don't see small businesses and more and a lot of larger businesses that have low wage workers getting medical leave through the private insurance market anytime soon. So I guess I'm answering you in a really funky way and saying I don't have a perfect answer for medical leave. But I think there's a fusion between a public-private sector market like New York State has, that has multiple options as opposed to like a single universal only this solution. What I can tell you is that in most states and in the federal government, I think we have agreement on parental leave. And I think you could get a parental plus from family caregiving in a really powerful, effective way. And that's where my head is on getting people meaningful, like those that are 100, 200, maybe even 300% of the poverty line, 90% or more of their wage replacement, so that they don't have to miss weeks and weeks of paychecks, and they can actually take care of themselves and their families. That would be my dream policy. Karen, what about you?
Yeah, I think that Adrienne lays out a really great way of approaching it. I know from our perspective at Third Way, we've been also thinking, how can we make policy progress, kind of looking at parental, medical, and caregiving leave a little bit separately. I think if you're talking about any sort of benefit, Adrienne's totally right that you want a kind of progressive sliding scale kind of wage replacement that's really capturing the low wage workers and ensuring, you don't have a wage replate of 50% that prevents them from being able to even afford to take leave. And I think that a recent report from New York found that the most claims for their paid leave program were coming from workers who made less than $40,000 a year. So when you're thinking about designing and implementing any sort of paid leave program, ensuring that you're kind of building something that can be accessed by low wage workers is super critical and important. I think also kind of just adding on just this flexibility element. I think specifically when you're talking about caregiving leave, as Adrienne mentioned, just it might be kind of you have 4 hours a week that you need to kind of take your aging parent to a doctor's appointment, or it might be kind of shorter instances of care. Being able to have that flexibility in any sort of benefit, I think is going to be really, really helpful. And whether that be I can take, work part-time for 8 weeks versus taking a full 2 weeks off, or some set kind of creation of the benefit that really allows this flexibility and types of care and how we are caregiving. And I think just kind of in the smaller policy things, I think the medical kind of data that's out there on medical leave, first and foremost, we don't know a lot. And I think that we could start by even just kind of small policy things. Well, what are people taking medical leave for? How are they taking it? What is that kind of in relation to FMLA? And the more we understand medical leave, the better we can make policy about it. And I think that goes for caregiving leave as well. So I think these are kind of like outside of an ideal policy, kind of paid leave policy. What are the small things that we can be just kind of getting done now that can help us also build better policy down the line?
This is the first time that I've heard like the caregiving 2 week being a huge benchmark. And certainly I've heard 12 weeks as the kind of gold standard.
I mean, it'd be gold standard, perfect policy.
Yeah,
totally.
For parental leave. Are there any kind of other gold standards you would want to put out there? So the other one I heard you, Adrienne, talk about was almost like a sliding scale, but knowing that the paid family leave is going to be most impactful for our low wage workers, because we know for many of them, 1 week is, missing your paycheck 1 week is making a life decision of whether you can put food on the table or pay a bill that you have. Any other kind of gold standard things that we should be advocating for?
It's a great question. So on parental leave, really, the science says like 1 to 2 years of mom and dad being with baby is like best for their outcomes. We've also learned that there's a really clear bell curve at 6 months. If a woman has more than 6 months of protected leave, they're more likely to have a hiring bias and an employer bias against them because of the implications of that. We also saw the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation actually retract their leave from being a year plus to being 6 months, because what they found was that the women were taking it, the men weren't. The women would come back to a job that had changed dramatically and really struggle to reorient themselves back into the environment. Like there's a ton of secondary effects to perfect policy, right? Like, so I think there's gold standard, and then there's like really making sure you're thinking about the outside places. But Rep. Clemons, if I can just say one thing that I think is different.
Yeah.
We're not going to get perfect policy. We need more people talking about the importance of paid leave and having some data underneath it and some stories underneath it. And if you have a chance, if any of you are in the state of Michigan, Pennsylvania, or Texas, Rep. Allred, Rep. Stevens, and Rep. Houlihan are the Democrats in the House who are really forging some super smart pathways to meaningful paid leave policy, and cheer them on for me, and really cultivate some next generation of leaders at the state, local, federal level who understand this issue. Because I think we just need more people knowing about it and thinking about it. It's this like caregivers, new parents, and family caregivers. It is a truly silent struggle. You do it out of the goodness of your heart with such love for who you're caring for. It is meaningful work that you're doing in an unpaid way. And you're often not telling your employer or your friends or your network what you're suffering through. So talk about caregiving, tell people what you're doing, ask people how their mom's doing and what they're doing in their lives. Like let caregiving become part of our vernacular so that we're living with it a little bit. And I think that's what this, audience today on this call can do to drive policy forward more than like, get into the intricacies of perfect policy. I think it's an awareness campaign that we really need. And we need more smart, thoughtful Democrats saying, I want to get something done. There are too many people that don't have any support systems. I don't want perfect policy as a platform. I want good policy that actually reaches my friends and my constituents.
I love that. And as working moms, like it is a struggle. And I think you are always afraid to show that struggle to other working moms because we're always trying to look like we got it all. And so I love that, like trying to normalize that it's hard for each other.
Yeah. First Lady Rosalynn Carter has this amazing quote that I'm going to butcher because she's been advocating around, making caregivers more visible for 40, 50 years. And she says, you either are a caregiver, you were a caregiver, you're going to need a caregiver, or you'll be a caregiver. And she's so right that that is, every one of us will experience this. Some of us in the most horrific, hardest ways. And some of us, slow drip struggle for 50 or 60 years. But there are situations where a little bit could go a long way into helping people balance these. And I'll leave you with two last things. If there's anybody here that cares about the gender pay gap, it is a motherhood pay gap. It comes from taking time off to care for your loved ones. 4 in 10 women in STEM leave the workforce altogether upon birth of the first child. It's mostly because, they're not Facebook workers. They're like mathematicians and scientists and researchers that get no paid leave. And upon the birth of their second child, then those numbers even skyrocket. Like if you want to know why we don't have gender parity in STEM, it's because we don't have paid leave. So there's a lot we can do to impact these like big macro societal challenges we have with these little policies.
I love that. As a mom to a girl who's very interested in being an engineer.
We need those.
I know. Yeah, but thinking, I mean, it's so hard to get girls to that. And then thinking about 40% of them leaving after having their first child and not returning is heartbreaking and such a loss for all of us. Corinne, anything you want to add to what Adrienne said? And then I have one final question. If anyone listening has a question, they can add it to the Q&A also.
Yeah, I think just to continue talking about, your situation. And I think everyone has a story or knows someone with a story about caregiving, medical leave, parental leave. And I think this continued conversation, and I think especially when it comes to women and knowing that women are more likely to be caregivers, more responsible for childcare and elder care for their family members. And the fact that, as Adrienne pointed out, is a big part of the gender pay gap. That's how we make economic progress for women, and is paid leave as part of that. And I also think, we talked a little bit about the gold standards and ideal policy. And I think also paid leave is part of a larger kind of economic agenda for helping kind of working families and women in particular. Affordable and accessible childcare is a key part of that as well. And it's kind of all these components that we can make progress on to really help uplift working families and help women be able to kind of navigate the balances of family and work, and creating the situation where, it doesn't have to be that only working certain jobs that are more flexible to be able to accommodate the caregiving responsibilities. And I think that the STEM example is part of that, and that kind of opens up more economic doors. So I think that that's kind of just a little bit to add on to that.
So we are living in this time. We had COVID, which uprooted us all in lots of different ways. I would say had disproportionate impact we see on women and mothers for sure. But then we've also so we've had that, and then we're in this very fast changing economy where we are seeing people in and out of jobs. Lots of, people, our employment rates are great, but there's a lot of people changing also. So what would you say, those two kind of big, this acceleration economically and then the response to COVID and coming out of it, how have those two things impacted this conversation and, both the conversation that's being had, but also the needs that are in front of us?
Okay, so I don't have those answers. I'll tell you how much I'm obsessed with that intersection that you've just talked about. My colleague Ben Giddis and I are doing this big body of research to try and understand why people who are not working right now and not looking for work, or who are looking for work but not working, what got them out of the workforce post-COVID, why their numbers increased so exponentially, what role is caregiving playing in their lives, and what role would certain types of policies play in getting them to work if they want to get back to work. Because I think that is like the biggest challenge that our country is facing right now. And we have to unlock what's underneath of it. I thought in the heart of early COVID, with frontline workers having no paid leave, no paid time to take quarantine, required quarantine. I mean, nurses were being required to quarantine for 21 days after getting or being exposed to COVID. And you know who gets no paid leave? Nurses. So 21 unpaid days. I thought we were going to have this revolution. And we even passed a pretty powerful paid leave law at the very beginning of COVID that helped cover a lot of people and mandate employer coverage. It was drowned out by other really important policies like unemployment insurance and PPP, because you couldn't double dip into those three policies. But I guess I'm heartbroken that I feel like we've forgotten what we learned at the beginning of COVID about how many people are working caregivers who don't have access to this policy that could really protect them and keep them connected to the workforce. I also am going to flip that over on the other side. We talked a little bit about that bell curve of hiring bias and what women already a working mother is perceived to be much less effective by both men and women. And a working father is considered much more productive. And that's where the pay inequity comes from. I'm very nervous about this next generation who had a lot put on their backs. I'm the mother of 5. During COVID, I was homeschooling kids and virtual schooling and working, and I was a disaster. And you know who picked up the slack for me? My amazing colleagues who didn't have a lot of caregiving responsibilities for a long time. And I'm super nervous about how that burden that we didn't compensate them for and that we didn't really acknowledge for years is going to affect the perception about people either wanting to have families or wanting to work with other parents for fear of that happening to them again. So I have no answers is my point, but I think there's a lot of that needs to be researched, studied, and thought about. And I think we have to think about two sides of that equation, because we put a lot on people, both the caregivers and the non-caregivers, over the last 3 years during the pandemic. And I'm not sure we've really unearthed the effects of that.
I think Adrienne talked a little bit about kind of why people aren't working and the caregiving responsibilities, and that's super important. I also think we've seen a lot of like data looking at women's participation rate has kind of rebounded from COVID, which is a great news, but I also always makes me think, like, what are the situations for those women like? Are they really struggling to manage work and care? And I think better understanding those experiences comes from, I think, again, talking more about it and understanding that more. And I also think kind of inherent in that data is understanding where different populations also are experiencing kind of this economic growth differently. I know some studies during the pandemic were looking at female participation for kind of mothers with a college degree and mothers without a college degree. And there were kind of big gaps there. You know, women with a college degree more likely to work kind of flexible jobs, not saying that they were definitely struggling with caregiving as well, but I think that flexibility and that the work they were doing made a big difference. And, you know, thinking about women without a college degree working more in person or shift scheduled jobs where childcare might not be available, and the sort of thing where paid leave is really, really important to kind of helping with that participation in the economy. And so I think that's one thing. I also think just the pandemic showing us that people need to have time to take care of themselves. And I think the paid sick time thing is part of that, you know, having that kind of 2 weeks of emergency time and now not having it, and really thinking like we need to make progress on that as well. I know you kind of mentioned nurses and teachers, and just knowing nurses and teachers in my life who don't have paid leave and are kind of trying to ration FMLA to do things. And it's crazy to think that these were the same people kind of keeping, you know, children educated, keeping communities healthy, and they're the ones kind of not being able to take care of themselves or their families while they were kind of taking care of the rest of us. And so I think that kind of thinking about those things are super important as we move forward. And I think that the nexus of those is super critical, as you said.
Karen nailed it, actually. I think that last part was the part that feels so like core to me, is how those frontline workers didn't have anything before and they don't now. And it's like we didn't learn.
Yeah. I mean, I like that you use the term heartbreaking, because I do a lot of advocacy here for early childhood, and which includes child care, which the workforce is 82% low income women of color in North Carolina. That is the statistic. And we right now we're about to hit this federal cliff of losing the benefits that they've been able to have to increase their hourly wages, and they are panicked. And, you know, we're advocating, we do have a bipartisan group advocating for state funding to continue those, which is good. I'm optimistic about that. But talking to them and hearing from them every single time makes me just want to scream, because I'm like, how are these women who are doing this critical work to our children and to our economy this stressed about where they are, you know? So I think heartbreaking is the way I would describe it, and I appreciate that word there. So we have a question from the audience, which is changing our where we are a little bit, which is good. With so many CEOs in the private sector being men, how do you recommend raising this issue to their attention to make it as a benefit that's proactively offered to employees? Adrienne?
Such a good question. So I helped work on something called the Family Leave Playbook that helps employees leverage their power to change corporate policy. It's a little bit of a toolkit that shows you how to prove that there's ROI benefits of policies like these. Like I was saying, you know, recruitment, retention, hiring like a improvement for hiring talent. There's a lot of really good outcomes from having a paid family and medical leave policy, and you can definitely put those in front of your CEOs. So I'll tell you, I'm going to flip it upside down and tell you what has shocked me in Congress is that some of the biggest champions of getting something done are men. Many of them are physicians who see the health and well-being benefits, but there are a lot of men that I think get this. Most of them have a story as to why. And it is often a daughter who is struggling with childcare and didn't have paid leave, and like that they saw personally, because the generation that they grew up in, no matter which men you're talking about, if they're old enough to be an elected official right now or a CEO, they likely didn't have the same structural challenges that the families of today do. but they often have somebody in their life who does. And you just got to pull that story forward. But I think men are making really good decisions in this place. They just have to be shown a path forward and a data-based reason to do it. So I highly encourage you to do a little bit of research on, how you make the case, what other companies have done, and what the outcome of it has been for the business itself. Microsoft launched a 12-week paid leave policy for all workers, and then they mandated their entire supply chain have any supplier business have a 12-week paid leave. Like, that's using your power. What got me into paid leave was I was a federal worker. I was pregnant with our third baby. I had a tough pregnancy, and I had a lot of doctor's appointments. I ate every sick day I had, and I didn't have much time with the baby. I had 2 weeks, and I was able to take about 4. It was bad, and I wanted to change that policy, right? Not me, but like lots of people together, we did that. And now every federal worker has 12 weeks of paid parental leave, regardless of ease of man or a woman. And you can affect major change with a little bit of data and a lot of elbow grease. But I think it all exists. The One Country has access to a really cool moderate toolkit on paid leave that'll get you all the data you need about the issue, about policy ideation. We don't have a lot in there about corporate policy change, but I'm down to write that paper for you. So anybody who needs a toolkit, we will put it together and help you modify policies. I also think we need to convene more CEOs around it. They need to see the value of it. They need to want to engage in it. There was a big Fortune 100 company about 6 years ago that changed their paid parental leave policy to 16 weeks. It was the best press they'd had in 10 years. 10 years.
I believe it. It would definitely get my attention. And I want to look up the Microsoft. I didn't know that. So that's a great success story. Here, our governor did an executive order for state employees to have paid family leave, and then it was codified into law this session. So, it's the same, like, if you are in a place to make a step, that it can lead to lots of trickle down things you're not ready for, Awesome.
Yeah, what we saw from the federal government too was that, when they changed policy, the big contractors also changed policy because they had 0 because the federal government, their customer, had 0. And I hope that happens in North Carolina too. I think it will. Like, the companies that do business with the government will see them setting an example and hopefully mirror it for more North Carolinians to have benefits.
Yes, me too. All right, Curran, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. I think, we talked a little bit about men taking leave, and I think that's also a big part of it, right? The more that we see men taking parental leave, doing that themselves, the more that we're setting the culture that paid leave is part of what creates better workplaces and healthier families and economies. I also think just having more opportunities for women to be at the table when we're having these conversations, I think that's obviously a little bit different outside of the paid leave scope. But when we have women CEOs, we're talking about these things a lot more and making those policies a lot more a part of kind of the conversation. And I also think that there are things that policymakers can be doing. I think, as a great example of leading by example, policymakers can be kind of making these efforts to, we have it at the federal level for federal contractors and workers. How can, employers be doing the same thing? And I think pointing to the data is a great example of that. I know when FMLA was kind of the fight against it was saying that businesses were going to hate it. And now I think over 95% either say they feel neutral or they feel positively. So seeing that that's kind of like using that data to show that even unpaid, leave has seen really, really high rates of approval and success for businesses, just continuing that fight for paid leave as well.
Okay. Thank you, guys. We are at the end of our time, which I have truly enjoyed being with both of you. And I love that I tell stories all the time because I think it's the best way to have an entry point to these bigger topics. So we've had some stories and some on the ground, but then some policy. So I'm grateful to both of you. You both have referenced research that is available, resources that are available. And I'll say my biggest advocate that I'm working with in the early childcare is a male Republican grandfather who cares very much for supporting his families and wanting families to be strong. So I think this is a space where we can come together, we can concretely solve problems, and we can help families have an easier time, which is in the moral best interest of our state and country, but also in the economic best interest. So thank you, Adrienne and Curran, for being with us.